After Ticinus, Rome had its first answer about what Hannibal was. Not a Carthaginian general in the tradition of the First Punic War, reactive, defensive, waiting for Rome to press him on terms Rome chose. What Ticinus communicated was a commander who understood Roman psychology as a weapon. Hannibal did not beat the Roman cavalry at Ticinus with superior numbers. The Numidian cavalry's fluid, unpredictable movement patterns were tactically superior to anything Roman cavalry training had developed a response for. The defeat was informational. The information said, the entity now in Italy is something you have not faced before. The two Roman consuls at their combined camp represented both possibilities. Scipio, wounded from Ticinus, had received the information from the wound. Longus, arriving fresh from the south with an undamaged ego and a Roman's instinctive certainty that direct engagement was the correct response to any military problem, had not received any information yet. He was about to. Hannibal had Celtic spies inside the Roman camp. He knew about Longus. He knew about the disagreement between the consuls. He built the Battle of Trebia around Longus's psychology the way an engineer builds a structure around known properties of the materials. The night before Trebia, Hannibal's men slept early and ate a full breakfast. At pre-dawn, his Numidian cavalry rode to the Roman camp and made noise outside the walls, taunting, provoking, appearing and withdrawing. Longus ordered the army out of camp immediately, before dawn, without eating, and marched them through a freezing December river in full armor to reach the Carthaginian position. On the far side of the river, a well-rested, well-fed, oil-covered army waiting in the morning. The oil was not comfort. The oil was a practical cold-weather insulation measure that also communicated, to any Roman who understood what he was seeing, that the army that had just crossed a freezing river was about to fight an army that had prepared for the cold while the Romans were being denied the preparation. Hannibal's brother Mago had spent the previous night in the riverside vegetation with a concealed force. When the battle reached its critical phase, Mago emerged from the reeds and struck the Roman rear. Trebia destroyed a second Roman army. Longus escaped and spent weeks lying to Rome about what had happened. The path south was blocked by the new consuls in fortified positions. Hannibal walked his army through the Arno marshlands, for days through waist-deep contaminated water, no dry ground, no sleep, cholera, pack animals dying under their loads. He lost his own sight in one eye to a marsh infection. He emerged on the other side of the Roman positions with 50,000 men and access to everything the Roman fortifications had been protecting. The Fabian strategy, shadow Hannibal, deny battle, wear him down, was correct and hated. The Roman people found patience unbearable when Hannibal was burning their farms in plain sight of an army doing nothing about it. Fabius Maximus understood something the previous consuls could not act on without being overruled by the institution they commanded. Engaging Hannibal in open battle was losing by definition. Every element of how Hannibal fought was designed to produce the conditions under which Hannibal won. The cavalry superiority. The intelligence on enemy psychology. The terrain selection. The concealed reserve force. The controlled retreat that converted Roman pressure into encirclement. Rome was providing the losses that Hannibal needed to maintain Celtic loyalty and demonstrate that his campaign was sustainable. The Fabian strategy removed those losses. It also removed the victories. Without victories, Hannibal could not keep the Celts. Without the Celts, he could not stay in Italy indefinitely. Fabius was not retreating. Fabius was building a position over time while degrading Hannibal's position over the same time. Hannibal understood this immediately. He tried to goad Fabius into battle. Fabius would not take the bait. Hannibal then tried to turn Rome against Fabius, burning every Roman farm in reach except Fabius's own, making it look like a secret arrangement. Fabius did not respond to this either. The Romans called him the delayer in mockery. Modern historians call the strategy of defeating an enemy by denying engagement while wearing down their position the Fabian strategy, and military institutions around the world still teach it. When Fabius's term ended, the Senate put together the largest army in Roman history, 80,000 men. The reasoning was mathematically Roman. Hannibal's victories came from tactical sophistication applied against the forces sent against him. An army of 80,000, they reasoned, would overwhelm any tactical sophistication by sheer mass. The numbers would make the trickery irrelevant. This reasoning was exactly what Hannibal needed Rome to believe. The Battle of Cannae. Hannibal's infantry numbered approximately 40,000. Rome outnumbered him 2-1. The Roman battle plan was direct: mass the infantry center, push it forward, break the Carthaginian line with overwhelming weight. Hannibal positioned his weakest infantry at the center in a convex bulge toward the Romans. Behind the wings, the elite Libyan infantry concealed. On the flanks, his cavalry, the finest combined force in the ancient world. The wind blowing from the south, at the Carthaginian back, into the Roman faces. The Romans attacked the center. The center was pushed back, bending inward. The Romans pushed deeper. The Romans compacted their formation tighter, pressing the success, the center giving way. The cavalry destroyed the Roman horse on both flanks and wheeled around behind. The Libyan infantry turned inward from both sides. Hannibal's center stopped retreating. The Romans were encircled. Their own mass, their own push, their own strength, had been used by Hannibal to place them inside a closing circle. Too tightly packed to maneuver. Too compressed to fight. The battle's outcome had been designed before it began, from the position of the wind to the shape of the center formation to the placement of the reserve wings. The killing at Cannae lasted hours. Between 60 and 80,000 Romans died in one afternoon. 20% of Rome's male population between 18 and 50 years old, killed in a single engagement. The Carthaginian soldiers became physically exhausted from the sustained killing before it was over. Hannibal waited for Rome to surrender. Rome did not surrender. The Senate met, received the accounting, the numbers, the consuls lost, the army gone, and voted to continue the war. Citizens presented themselves for military service. Freed slaves were enrolled in the legions. The city began building the next army while the blood of the last one was still fresh on the Cannae plain. The officer who famously told Hannibal to march immediately on Rome after the victory, Hannibal, Hannibal's cavalry commander, said, "You know how to win battles but not how to use victories." Hannibal had no siege equipment. He had no supply line to Rome. He had an army that had just won the greatest tactical victory in the ancient world and could not translate it into the capture of a city he could see at 4 days' march without the capacity to breach its walls. Hannibal waited for Rome to make the rational decision that the mathematics required. Rome was not making decisions from mathematics. Rome was making decisions from identity. Surrender was not a category the Roman identity contained. The decision to continue after Cannae was not courage in the sentimental sense, it was the specific refusal of an institution to accept the logical conclusion that the numbers produced. Most of southern Italy defected to Hannibal after Cannae. Rome's alliance system, the network of Italian city-states that provided the manpower and resources that made Rome's military capacity sustainable, began to fracture. The second largest city on the peninsula joined Hannibal. The dominoes of a consequence Hannibal had been pushing toward since he swore an oath at 9 years old were falling. Carthage's intelligence from the battlefield sent word home, Rome is finished. Carthage's politicians did not send Hannibal what he needed to finish it. At the survivor camp near Cannae, soldiers were discussing abandoning Rome. A 17-year-old junior officer named Scipio drew his sword and threatened to kill any man who left. The soldiers stopped discussing it. That officer would defeat Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC. At 17, in a survivor camp outside a battle where his father's army had been destroyed, with a sword drawn against men who had just survived the worst military disaster in Roman history, the arc of the Second Punic War was already visible in the face of the young man holding it. Rome never surrendered. It is not a military fact. It is a fact about identity. And identity, it turns out, is the most durable military asset any civilization can possess. The Cannae battlefield held 30,000 gallons of blood. The estimate comes from ancient sources who calculated the volume from the number of dead. The number is the ancient world's attempt to communicate a scale for which words were not sufficient. 30,000 gallons on a flat plain in southern Italy in August. Ancient writers reported that you could smell it miles away. Hannibal's army began searching the battlefield for its own dead. The Carthaginian casualties were several thousand, significant, but a fraction of what Rome lost. The Carthaginians moving through the battlefield had difficulty processing what they were seeing. Several ancient writers noted that the victorious soldiers appeared stunned by the scale of what their victory had produced. Military genius at its full expression produces a result that surprises even the people who produced it. Fabius Maximus, whose strategy had been mocked and abandoned and whose instinct had been correct, was not in a position to say he had been right. Being right about a military strategy after it was rejected and replaced with a catastrophe does not produce the political credit that winning would have produced. Rome would take the war seriously now. Rome was already taking it seriously, in the specific way that Roman institutions took things seriously, by mobilizing, organizing, recruiting, and rebuilding without announcing that they were doing it or explaining why. The Senate's decision after Cannae was not announced to the Roman people in the way victories were announced. It was simply implemented. New legions. New consuls. New strategy. The Senate did not hold a ceremony for the decision to not surrender. The decision was simply visible in the legions being organized in the forum and the recruitment stations and the freed slaves presenting themselves for service. Hannibal's strategic position after Cannae was paradoxical. He had won the war's decisive engagement by every military measure. He had inflicted losses Rome could not absorb and remain a functioning state, except that Rome was still functioning. He controlled most of southern Italy. The alliance system that sustained Rome's military capacity was fracturing. He needed Carthage to send reinforcements, supplies, the siege capacity to take Rome itself. The reinforcements that would have converted the greatest tactical victory in the ancient world into the end of the Roman state were in Carthage, and Carthage's politicians chose not to send them. The gap between what Hannibal needed and what Carthage sent is the Second Punic War's central fact. Hannibal was the greatest general of the ancient world fighting without the support of the civilization that had sent him. He would spend 13 more years in Italy winning battles and waiting for Rome to do the thing the battles required it to do. Rome would not do it. After Cannae, the war changed shape. What had been a series of catastrophic Roman defeats became a different kind of conflict, one in which Hannibal could not produce the decisive result because the decisive result required either Roman surrender or siege capacity he did not have, and Rome would not surrender and Carthage would not send the siege engineers. Fabius Maximus's strategy was reinstated as Roman policy, not because the Senate admitted he had been right but because the alternative, giving Hannibal the open field engagements he needed to convert southern Italian defections into the complete collapse of the Roman alliance system, had just cost 80,000 lives. The Romans learned to stop fighting Hannibal on Hannibal's terms. They learned this the same way Rome learned everything, by paying the full price of the lesson before applying it. Hannibal spent 13 years in Italy. He won every major engagement he fought. He never took Rome. The war ended not because Hannibal was defeated in Italy but because a Roman general named Scipio, the young officer who drew his sword at the Cannae survivor camp, took the war to Carthage itself. Threatened Carthage directly. Forced Hannibal to leave Italy undefeated because Carthage needed him home. Hannibal left Italy 13 years after entering it. He met Scipio at Zama in 202 BC. The battle was fought on a plain in North Africa. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactical innovations against him, double envelopment, controlled encirclement, the same geometry that produced Cannae. Hannibal lost. The Second Punic War ended. Carthage paid a new indemnity. Carthage was reduced. Hannibal went into exile. He spent his exile building military alliances against Rome from various eastern courts, fighting as a commander for other kings, staying useful to any power that might eventually threaten Rome. When Rome demanded his extradition from the king of Bithynia in 183 BC, Hannibal poisoned himself rather than be taken. He left a note that read, in approximate translation, "Let us now relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it too tedious to wait for an old man's death. Hannibal Barca drowned in a Spanish river in 228 BC. His son spent 60 years honoring the oath sworn in a Carthaginian temple at 9 years old. He won the greatest victories the ancient world's military had produced. He lost the war that required them to mean something. And he died rather than be taken by the people he had made his life's purpose to defeat. Rome never surrendered. That is the sentence the Second Punic War produced. Not Cannae. Not the Alps. Not the 37 elephants or the 30,000 gallons of blood. The sentence the war produced was, Rome never surrendered. And that sentence is why Rome eventually controlled the entire Mediterranean basin and why Carthage was salted into the ground. And this was only part 2.